Okay, this video is about Socrates and Plato. Academic heroes number 12 and 13. Socrates lived from 470 to 399 BC, is the great hero of philosophy, the martyr of philosophy, the saint of philosophy, and Cicero, the greatest of the Romans, who really admired Socrates, said this of him: Socrates is the wisest and most upright of all men. Socrates has called philosophy down from the heavens and made it useful to the common man. Okay, then Arthur Herman, he lived from 1956 onwards to current. He wrote this great book called The Light in the Cave. I think it's the best philosophy book ever written. I've read a lot of them. There's other great ones, of course. But anyways, here's what Arthur Herman said about it. He said, Cicero saw Plato and Aristotle as the twin fountainheads of Western reason, intellectual co-equals who sum up the entire scope of human knowledge at that time. And they're really almost like opposites. Aristotle is like pro-individualism, the individual thinking man, versus Plato is more, humans are subjects ruled by philosopher, guardian kings. So Aristotle has much more sort of respect for the educated individual than does Plato in general. Socrates is most famous for the Socratic method of teaching, Socratic questioning, which is a great way to teach because it gets you to pay attention and be alert. And a little bit of stress is good. Excess stress, not good. But a little bit of stress, it's part of just being awake and alert. So he asks you a question, helps you to remember the question better. The Socratic method of progressive questioning to work to the truth, that's really how you get to the truth about complex things. So it's a great approach to learning. And the Greeks were famous for that, the ancient Greeks, with being able to encourage an open debate on a wide variety of subjects, because a lot of the ancient world was not like that. Many countries were these big flat countries, and there would be a tyrant who would just control everyone and not allow them to have individual opinions on anything controversial. Versus the Greeks had a whole bunch of hilly and mountainous and coastal areas and different islands and stuff, and it led to a whole bunch of separate individualistic populations that led to more free speech between them. Okay, so some quotes by Socrates. Useful knowledge helps us to live a better life. Go wherever the facts lead. The highest wisdom consists in distinguishing good and bad. That's an important point. People should be allowed to have an opinion and not just then, yelled at if they don't agree with whoever has the social or political power of the moment, because that's how you get to the truth. A lot of times the truth is not going to be popular. Okay, Socrates continues, no one can transfer knowledge directly to a student. The most that can be done is to encourage the student to think by asking them questions and so cause the student to learn the material for themselves. The purpose of philosophy is to determine how we ought to live. In order to decide how to live well, we should try to learn what is good for us and what is bad for us. And that's simple, but it's actually profound in the sense that you think about a modern medical student, they study all this irrelevant minutia about diseases they're never going to see in their life, but then you ask them basic questions, what is the difference between a starch and a simple sugar, and a lot of other basic questions, they won't know anything about what you're talking about. Okay, Socrates continues. Whether a man marries or not, in either case, he will regret it. If he gets a good wife, he'll be happy. If he gets a bad one, he'll become a philosopher. The beginning of wisdom is the definition of terms. The fastest path to glory is to strive to become what you wish to be. To do good to others benefits our own souls. When the debate is lost, slander becomes the tool of the loser. During Socrates' trial, the courtroom questioner asked him, aren't you ashamed of going around behaving in such a way that everyone in Athens hates you? Socrates replies, no, I am on a mission from God to follow the truth. Wherever it leads, I would be ashamed of myself if I didn't do this. Okay, now some critics of Socrates and Plato. Nietzsche hated Socrates and Plato. He felt that they pulled men into other worlds rather than getting men to pay attention to this world, what was going on right in front of them. Nietzsche preferred men in the old style of Greek, the idiot and the oddity, And he considered himself a Dionysian in a sense. Dionysian, the god of wine and theater and revelry and a little bit of wild craziness. And he thought that Socrates and Plato were Apollonian wussies. So Apollo was sort of the god of wisdom and is much more thoughtful. But in Nietzsche's opinion, he was also kind of wimpy. And in a sense, what Nietzsche was saying is that the ancient traditions of the Iliad and the Odyssey, the warrior Greek, the strong man, helped keep the Greek people free. And that these philosophers come along like the sophists and, well, especially like also Socrates and Plato, and they sort of created a lack of respect for some of the ancient Greek culture, and that to some extent wimpified the Greeks. And Nietzsche thought that was a bad thing. And there's been a lot of similar philosophical opinions over the course of history. For example, Edward Gibbon, the author of The Fall of the Roman Empire, felt that the Christianity had weakened the Romans. Machiavelli in Italy around 1500, he felt that Christianity had weakened the Italians. Okay? There's different ways to look at that. Other people said it was simply because there was a bunch of individualized city-states that did not unify and therefore could not hold off the French, for example. Aristophanes, a contemporary of Socrates, felt that Socrates was just another sophist and destructive, that his philosophical questioning had led to a lack of respect for tradition, for the gods, a loss of faith amongst the people, and that this led to a loss of unity in society. Aristophanes wrote a play about Socrates called The Clouds, which mocked Socrates as sort of a corrupter of youth, and that later contributed to some of the negative opinions against him in his trial in 399 BC. Okay, Will Durant's quote, "Greek philosophy destroyed the Greek religion, which had formed the moral strength of ancient Greece." Then he goes on, Plato's perspective was mystical, Aristotle's perspective was medical. Okay, but Will Durant's famous philosopher from America, he lived from 1885 to 1981. Then the next person was a very brilliant Edward de Bono, MD, PhD. He lived from 1933 to 1921. And he called Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle the Greek gang of three. He felt they overly dominated philosophy. De Bono said that they overemphasized critical thinking, that they're very good at tearing something down, but they really didn't do as much creative thinking as you would hope. And he felt that their style of thinking was good for criticizing something and poking holes in it, but it didn't really come up with that many new ideas. And De Bono said that this overemphasis on critical thinking to criticize something was used by the Catholic Church to refute heretics, but that it set back thinking in the West for hundreds of years because it didn't appreciate, respect, acknowledge enough creative thinking, coming up with positive solutions to make things better. And, okay, we'll go with that. We'll go to the next slide here. Okay, some more critics of Socrates. And whenever you study a subject, you should always look at both points of view because that's where you end up figuring out what you think is correct for yourself. Robert Pirsig, he wrote the incredible book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Pirsig lived from 1928 to 2017, and he thought that Socrates and Plato were kind of hypocrites, that they themselves were trying to use the best possible rhetoric, stylish ways of speaking to make their own arguments more persuasive. And he also felt they underestimated the arete sense of the earlier Greeks. So here's a long quote from Pirsig. "The halo around the heads of Plato and Socrates is now gone." Phaedrus, who was talking with Socrates, now sees that they are consistently doing exactly that which they accuse the sophists of doing. They're using emotionally persuasive language for the ulterior purpose of making the weaker argument in the dialectic seem the stronger. Socrates was not using dialectic to understand rhetoric. He was using it to destroy rhetoric, or at least to bring rhetoric into disrepute. And so his questions were not really true questions at all. They were just word traps in which Gorgias was known as the sophist philosopher, and his fellow rhetoricians would fall into. Phaedrus would have asked, what evidence do we have that the dialectical question and answer method of arriving at truth comes before everything else? we have no evidence whatsoever that dialectic comes before everything else. And if that statement is isolated and itself given scrutiny, it becomes ridiculous. Here's this dialectic, like Newton's law of gravity, sitting by itself in the middle of nowhere, giving birth to the universe. Hey, it's asinine. Dialectic, which is the parent of logic. So dialectic is a conversation, and that led to logic, came itself from rhetoric. Rhetoric is in turn a child of the myths and the poetry of ancient Greece. That is so historically, and it is so by any application of common sense. The poetry and myths of the ancient Greeks were the response of a prehistoric people to the universe around them, made on the basis of quality. And quality means like arete, a sense of intuitive excellence, what a man just recognizes as good or great. And it is quality, arete, not dialectic, which is the generator of everything we know. That's from Robert Pirsig and his book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which is a great book. It's another one of the all-time great philosophy books. And, part of what this is all about is just the obvious point that if you let a person's mind pursue knowledge about something that they're interested in, they can do incredible achievements. People are very smart when they're pursuing something that they really care about, and they're kind of lazy and stupid if they're forced to study something they don't want to. They just passively, aggressively decline to do so, and they don't achieve much, which is how most education is. Walter Fisher was another expert in communication. He lived from 1931 to 2018, and his view is a lot like Robert Pirsig from Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, and he emphasized what he would call the quality of an argument. It's called the narrative paradigm. How good is the story? That can be more important than how accurate is the logic. Okay, so Walter Fisher believed that Plato and Aristotle overemphasized a rational world paradigm, that people were logical and rational and you could just have a conversation based on logic. Some of that comes from basically Plato and Aristotle and Socrates. They were just talking to other Greek aristocrats primarily, so other people of similar social status and similar educations. Versus what Walter Fisher is saying is a lot of times that's not the case. And it's also quite often that the narrative, the emotional content of the story becomes more persuasive than the argument. A good story can be more persuasive than a good logical argument. So overall, my opinion, I love Aristotle. The more you study him, the more you like him, the more good things you'll see came from his way of thinking and behaving. I really like Socrates a lot. Socrates is sort of intertwined with Plato, though, because Socrates never wrote his own books. Plato just wrote all the dialogues, and Socrates was the hero of them. So sometimes Plato, you think, was speaking through Socrates, if you will. And I respect Plato, but I don't really like him because Plato was very much against freedom for the masses. And I think this stuff is worth knowing about because these are the early traditions of Western culture, and all through the history of the world, most of the time, populations have been in servitude as serfs or slaves, and understanding freedom, what generates it and what blocks it, is a useful thing if you ever hope to have some. Okay, continuing now. In 399 BC, Socrates was convicted of disrespecting the gods and corrupting the youth. Plato, who lived from 428 to 347 BC, was a student of Socrates, and Plato considered Socrates the wisest, most noble man in all of Athens. Plato was saddened by the death of Socrates, and he says, what kind of a society would kill its wisest and most noble man? That actually happens a lot in societies, unfortunately. Plato was embittered by the loss of Athens to Sparta. In the Peloponnesian War, the Athenians, they did a whole bunch of stupid things like the way they treated Alcibiades. But Plato also had been harshly treated by King of Sicily, King Dionysius, who he had went and worked with and who he had hoped would be guided by his views but was not. Plato also was a bit of a frustrated playwright. And so anyways, Plato wanted to write a book. He wrote a book about how to create an ideal society, one that would honor a man like Socrates. And he felt that, in his opinion, the wisest men were the philosophers like him, so the philosophers should be kings, and they would be called the philosopher kings or guardians. And his greatest book, Plato's Republic. Because Sparta had won the war, the Peloponnesian, over Athens, Plato had more admiration for their society than one would expect for an educated man. Plato's most famous for his writing style, and this is the thing I like best about Plato, the dialectic. So there'd be a whole bunch of persons having a conversation, and the great thing about that is you can hear all these different opinions on a subject. And in another way, that's also a form of what is called esoteric writing. So eso means to be inside of, like an insider group, an inside joke. It's understandable only to a select audience. It can also mean esoteric, something's overly detailed and difficult to read. It can also mean like a cuttlefish. It sprays ink all over the place, if you will, to hide its true meaning. Versus the other type of writing, the typical thing, what we're used to, is so-called exoteric. So exo means on the outside or the outer, and that's to speak openly. So what I'm basically saying is Plato would hide his own opinions, and that's esoteric writing, by having one of the persons in the dialogue amongst many give an opinion. So you wouldn't know exactly what Plato's opinion was quite often. You would just hear the different opinions spoken. And there's some benefits to that. You get to hear all the different opinions without being pressured to commit to any one of them early on. So you can figure out for yourself what you believe. And it's a great way to write. It can also be very entertaining. In a lot of my books, I'll do that trick too. I'll have a whole bunch of different historical figures all debating a subject, and I think that helps get all points of view shown. Plato wanted a new type of hero for Athens, an intellectual hero like Socrates, rather than what he saw as the overly violent and physical men of the past, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Plato's most famous metaphor is the allegory of the cave, where the ignorant masses are living down in a cave and all they can see is the shadows on the wall of the cave, and they think the shadows are real. And Socrates is a prototype of the enlightened man who walks up out of the cave into the true sunlight, sees reality, sees nature and everything. And then if he tries to go back, though, the people in the caves don't want to hear it. It's kind of like when somebody learns to become a vegan and they go back and talk to the meat-eating, processed food-eating masses. They don't want to hear about the vegan diet. Okay, so here's a quote from Socrates. If anyone tried to release the people from the cave and lead them up out of the cave, the rulers of the cave would kill him. The bitter truth is that most people prefer to live in the cave. They get upset, even furious, when someone challenges their fondest illusions. Unfortunately, that's all too true. Okay, Plato now continued. Plato promoted a view of life, society, the ideal society, kind of like Darwinism. He felt that people should be bred like farm animals. You pick the ones that you want to breed, let's say to create a warrior or to create whatever type of person you want. And so that's sort of like eugenic marriages, okay? And he didn't even think the children should be raised by the parents. They should be, raised by the society for whatever they were going to be trained to become. And he felt they should not be free to their parents or whoever was raising them to teach them anything they wanted. They should only be taught what was approved by the philosopher guardians. So you can see how controlling Plato was. And Plato didn't have much respect for people's intellects. Plato said, the people have no understanding, and they only repeat what the rulers are pleased to tell them. Plato promoted a collectivist society like the Spartans, with no private property and no poetry. So Plato's society was kind of like an early form of communism. And again, people don't like that. People want to own stuff. People want to be free to do what they enjoy. Aristotle promoted individualism, and the tradition following Aristotle is one of individualism and creative thought, versus the tradition of Plato is largely one of control and things like that. Plato did say some good things. The noblest of all studies is what a man is, what his life should be. No man is more hated than he who speaks the truth. Philosophy is the love of learning and the love of wisdom. When men speak ill of you, live so that no one will believe them. And then, I like what he says about child education. Knowledge that is acquired under compulsion obtains no hold on the mind. Yeah, if the kid's forced to learn something, they're not going to remember it or care about it. Necessity is the mother of invention. When you read these ancient Greeks, their philosophers and their quotes and stuff, you see so much modern stuff that they were the original source of it. Okay, Plato, academic hero number 13, continued. He who is only an athlete is too crude, too vulgar, too much a savage. He who is only a scholar is too soft, too effeminate. The ideal citizen is the scholar-athlete, the man of thought and the man of action. The beginning of a work is the most important part of a work. Those who tell the stories rule the society. The first thing will be to establish a censorship of the writers of fiction, and to let the censors receive any tale of fiction which is good, and to reject the bad. And we will desire mothers and nurses to tell their children the authorized versions only. So that's, Plato totally trying to control the narrative and what's taught to children. That's a way, a tyrant controls people, limits their range of knowledge and thought. So Plato continues, democracy passes into despotism. When a tyrant first appears, he calls himself the protector. Democracy passes into despotism. So that's it. Hope that was helpful.